The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion. Hello, and welcome. I want you to imagine something for a moment. Picture a quiet evening at home. Maybe there's a fire crackling in the background, gentle conversation flowing, the simple, familiar comfort of sitting down to dinner with someone you love. It's a moment you've lived 1,000 times before, completely normal, completely safe. And then, in a heartbeat, everything changes. That's where our story begins today, with 3 sentences that hit like a punch to the chest. Life changes fast. Life changes in the instant. You sit down to dinner, and life as you know it ends. These words belong to Joan Didion, one of the most brilliant writers of our time. For decades, she built her reputation on cool, precise, almost surgical prose. She could take apart a cultural moment or political crisis with laser focus, revealing truths the rest of us missed. But in her masterpiece, The Year of Magical Thinking, she does something different. She turns that unflinching gaze inward onto the most chaotic and bewildering experience of her life, the sudden death of her husband of 40 years, writer Gregory Dunne. This book became a phenomenon, not because it offered tidy answers or comforting advice about getting over loss. It became essential reading because it told the brutal truth. It mapped out a territory of grief that's wild, illogical, and sometimes completely unhinged. Didion named something many of us secretly believe when tragedy strikes, that if we wish hard enough, if we perform the right rituals, if we just don't give away his shoes, he might come back. She called this magical thinking. Today, we're going to walk through that year with her. This isn't just a story about sadness. It's a detective story where the detective is a grieving mind, trying to solve an unsolvable mystery. It's an achingly beautiful love story about a 40-year marriage. And it's ultimately a survival guide for navigating life's deepest waters. By the end, you'll understand something strange and powerful about how the human mind operates under unimaginable pressure. And you'll see why confronting our hardest moments doesn't just teach us about death, but reveals profound truths about love, memory, and what it really means to survive. Let's begin. December 30th, 2003, a Tuesday. Joan Didion and her husband, Gregory Dunne, had just come home to their New York apartment after another exhausting hospital visit. Their only daughter, Quintana, lay unconscious in intensive care, fighting for her life against pneumonia and septic shock. The day had been crushing, but the evening fell into familiar rhythms. Should they go out or eat at home? Joan decided to build a fire. Fires mattered to them. They signaled safety, that the family circle was complete for the night. She made John a scotch. He settled into his usual chair by the fire, reading. She set the table, lit candles. He asked for a second drink. They sat down. He was talking about World War I, or maybe the scotch. She couldn't later remember which, and then he wasn't. She looked up. His left hand was raised, and he was slumped, motionless. For a split second, she thought it was some weird joke, an attempt to break the tension. "Don't do that," she remembers saying. But he didn't respond. He fell forward against the table, then to the floor. What happened next is a blur that anyone who's faced sudden tragedy will recognize. The 911 call. The dispatcher asking if he was breathing. Her reply, "Just come." The paramedics turning her living room into a war zone of medical equipment. Syringes, defibrillator paddles, incomprehensible jargon. She remembers thinking with strange, detached clarity. She needed to be ready. She grabbed his medical history, her handbag, her keys, because obviously the next step would be the hospital, and she couldn't get left behind. At the emergency entrance, a man was waiting. He wasn't in scrubs like everyone else. He turned to her. "I'm your social worker," he said. And that, she writes, is when she must have known. There's a kind of thinking that kicks in during these moments. Desperate, illogical bargaining with reality. She read an account later from a mother whose son was killed in Iraq. The mother saw the soldier in dress greens at her door and thought that as long as she didn't let him in, he couldn't deliver the news, and then it wouldn't be true. Didion recognized that feeling instantly. Standing in the emergency room, she focused on paperwork, insurance cards, logistics of transferring John to a better hospital once he was stabilized. She was trying to manage the situation. As long as there were details to handle, the unthinkable could stay at bay. But the social worker led her into a small, cold room. A doctor came in. "He's dead, isn't he?" she heard herself say. The social worker looked at the doctor, then said something that would echo in her mind for months. "It's okay, she's a pretty cool customer." But this coolness wasn't strength. It was shock. A kind of self-protective numbness. A state of disbelief so deep that the reality of death hadn't been allowed to penetrate. And this shock was compounded by something else. Her grief for John was horribly interrupted, because every single day she had to face the fact that her daughter, Quintana, might also die. Quintana had fallen ill on Christmas morning with what seemed like flu, but it had exploded into something terrifying. She was in an induced coma, on a respirator, her body swollen, her chances of survival somewhere between 56 and 69%. Every day, Joan and John had gone to the intensive care unit, held her hand, and whispered their family code, a line from the movie Robin and Marian, "I love you more than one more day." On that final night, December 30th, just hours before he died, they'd spoken to a doctor who told them, "We're still not sure which way this is going." John had been consumed with helpless rage, asking anyone who would listen, "How does flu morph into whole-body infection?" It was a cry against the randomness of it all, against the ordinary circumstances that had led to this unthinkable place. Now, John was gone, and Quintana was still unconscious. For weeks, Joan couldn't even tell her daughter that her father was dead. The normal rituals of mourning, the funeral, the family gathering, had to be delayed. Her grief hung in suspended animation, trapped between two impossible realities. This is the crucible where her year of magical thinking was born. That first night, after coming home alone from the hospital to the devastating silence of their apartment, she insisted on being alone. It wasn't bravery. It was something more primal. As she writes, "I needed to be alone so that he could come back." This is the heart of magical thinking. Her rational mind, the mind of that cool customer, knew he was dead. The New York Times was preparing his obituary. She'd authorized an autopsy, but on a deeper, more primitive level, she believed what happened was reversible. This belief showed up in subtle, secret ways. For months, she couldn't read his obituaries. When she finally saw his photograph in the Academy Awards in memoriam montage, she was struck by a horrifying thought. I had allowed other people to think he was dead. I had allowed him to be buried alive. The most powerful example was the issue of his clothes. Friends and family gently suggested she give them away, a necessary step in the grieving process. She tried. She filled some bags with sweatshirts and shoes and took them to a nearby church. But when she went to his closet to gather the rest of his shoes, she stopped. She couldn't do it. And then she understood why. He would need shoes if he was to return. The recognition of this thought, she writes, by no means erased it. She was thinking like a small child, as if her wishes had the power to change reality. This wasn't metaphor. It was deeply felt, urgent. Even her insistence on an autopsy, she realized later, was part of it. Maybe, her magical thinking whispered, they would find something simple, something fixable. A minor blockage. A pacemaker that needed resetting. Maybe they could still fix it. As she navigated this strange, secret world of magical thoughts, she was also plunged repeatedly into what she calls the vortex. The vortex effect is the whirlpool of memory, triggered by the most ordinary things. Grief, she discovered, isn't a steady state of sadness. It comes in waves, sudden ambushes that weaken your knees and blur your vision. For Didion, who'd shared a life and home with her husband 24 hours a day as they both worked as writers, the world was a minefield of triggers. Driving in Los Angeles, where they'd lived for decades, became an exercise in avoidance. She couldn't pass the movie theater where they saw The Graduate in 1967. She couldn't hear certain songs on the radio. A television commercial showing a familiar stretch of coastline would suddenly pull her back in time to the house where they'd brought Quintana home as a baby. One memory would connect to another, and another, dragging her down into a spiral of associations, a past so vivid it felt more real than the empty present. It was a house in Malibu in the 70s, making soufflés with friends. It was Honolulu, rewriting a script at the Royal Hawaiian Hotel. It was a private joke about the Princeton Nassoons, a singing group whose performance style John used to lovingly mock. These weren't just sweet memories. They were painful, because each one led back to the same dead end. He was gone. The person who shared those memories, who could validate them, who could finish the story, was no longer there. The line was cut. She was holding a phone with no one on the other end. In her search for some kind of map through this wilderness, Didion, ever the reporter, turned to research. She read everything she could find about grief. She read Freud on mourning and melancholia. She read medical studies about how grief affects the body, learning that dolphins have been observed refusing to eat after the death of a mate, and geese will search for a lost partner until they themselves become disoriented and lost. She learned that the recently bereaved have significantly higher mortality rates, that they forget their own phone numbers, that they make terrible business decisions. But the most useful text came from a surprising source, Emily Post's 1922 Book of Etiquette. In a world before death was hidden away in hospitals, Emily Post wrote with practical, matter-of-fact wisdom about the physical realities of grief. She understood that people in mourning are physically unbalanced, that their circulation is disturbed, that they're cold. She advised offering them hot broth, not cold milk. She understood they need protection from overwhelming emotion. This old-fashioned advice felt more in touch with Didion's reality than any modern psychology. She remembered how cold she'd been in the hospital that night, and realized it wasn't just the December air, it was her body shutting down in shock. This intellectual search was one way of coping, but reality kept intruding with new waves of crisis. Just a day and a half after they finally held John's memorial service in March, Quintana, who was slowly recovering, flew to California. It was meant to be the first day of the rest of her life. That afternoon, she collapsed at the Los Angeles airport. An ambulance rushed her to UCLA, where a scan revealed a massive brain hematoma, a bleed causing so much pressure it was shifting her brain. One of her pupils was fixed and dilated, a sign of impending brain death. The other went as they wheeled her into emergency neurosurgery. Didion was plunged back into the nightmare. the intensive care units, the uncertain prognoses, the terrifying medical terminology. It was Beth Israel all over again, but this time, John wasn't there to face it with her. She was now the sole protector, the one whispering, "You're safe. I'm here," while grappling with the terrifying knowledge that this was a promise she couldn't keep. Through another long month of hospitals, Didion fought for her daughter, trying to manage the unmanageable, trying to be the calm, competent person the world expected her to be, all while her internal world was still governed by magical thinking and the vortex of grief. The turning point, if you can call it that, was subtle. It came months later, in August 2004, at the Republican National Convention in Madison Square Garden. She was on an escalator, a place she'd been with John just the previous November, on their way to a basketball game the night before they left for Paris. That memory triggered others of another convention in that same building years earlier. And standing there, surrounded by noise and chaos, she had a realization. All these months, she'd been trying to reverse time, to run the film backward and substitute an alternate reel where he didn't die. But now, for the first time, she wasn't trying to change the outcome. She was just trying to reconstruct what had happened. It was a shift from magical thinking to mourning, from trying to undo the past to trying to understand it. The final piece of that understanding came when she finally received John's autopsy report, almost a year after his death. It was stark and clinical. It described a greater than 95% blockage in two of his main coronary arteries. One of them, the left anterior descending artery, was the one doctors grimly call the widowmaker. It confirmed what she'd been told but couldn't accept. Nothing could have been done. He was dead the instant he slumped in his chair. The report didn't bring closure. Didion doesn't believe in closure. But it did bring a kind of clarity. It closed the door on magical thinking. There was no alternate reel. There was only what was. The book doesn't end with a neat resolution or triumphant recovery. Grief, she shows us, isn't a problem to be solved. It's a place, a new landscape you must learn to navigate. The craziness recedes, but the absence remains. In the final pages, she remembers swimming with John into a sea cave at a house they lived in long ago. To get into the cave, you had to catch the swell of the tide at just the right moment. It was scary. You had to time it perfectly. She was always afraid, but John never was. He told her, you had to feel the swell change, you had to go with the change. And that's the final hard-won wisdom of this extraordinary book. Life changes. The swell changes. We can't reverse it. We can't control it. All we can do is try to feel the change, and somehow go with it. What makes the year of magical thinking unforgettable is its searing, unflinching honesty. In a world that wants us to grieve quickly, quietly, and then move on, Joan Didion gives us permission to acknowledge the raw, messy, utterly irrational reality of loss. She reminds us that grief isn't a neat, linear process with 5 tidy stages. It's a tidal wave. It's a vortex. It's a state of temporary insanity where the most brilliant, rational mind can find itself believing that a dead husband might need his shoes. She doesn't offer platitudes or easy comfort. Instead, she offers something far more valuable: recognition. When we read her words, we see our own potential for disorientation, our own secret bargains with fate, reflected back with breathtaking clarity. The book's most powerful lesson, I think, is about the nature of memory and marriage. A 40-year partnership, she shows us, is a shared reality. It's a private language, a collection of jokes no one else gets, a history that lives in 2 minds. When one of those minds is gone, reality itself fractures. The memories are still there, but they're unmoored, incomplete. This is the unending absence she speaks of, not just the absence of a person, but the absence of the one who held the other half of your story. So what can we take from this journey? How can it help us right now? Here are a few thoughts. First, let's remember the wisdom of Emily Post and the power of practical kindness. When someone we know is grieving, our instinct is often to say, "Let me know if there's anything I can do." Didion's experience shows us that a person in shock is often incapable of knowing what they need. Instead of asking, just do. Bring a meal. Water the plants. Walk the dog. These small, concrete acts can be a lifeline in overwhelming emotion. Second, this book is a powerful reminder to pay attention to the ordinary instance of our own lives, the quiet dinners, the shared jokes, the mundane routines. We so often live for the big moments, graduations, weddings, promotions, that we forget a life is built not in milestones, but in moments. Didion's story is a heartbreaking reminder that those ordinary moments are the most precious things we have, because, as she tells us, life as you know it can end in the instant you sit down to dinner. Finally, this book opens a door to talk about things we're often too afraid to discuss: death, loss, and the fragility of life. It's a difficult conversation, but a necessary one. Sharing this book, or even just the ideas within it, can create space for the kind of honest dialogue that helps us feel less alone in our most vulnerable moments. That was the book summary of The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion. We've touched on the core of her journey today, but I have to be honest with you, a summary can only show you the map. The real power is in walking the territory yourself. The magic of this book is in the quiet moments, when one of Didion's precise, devastating sentences lands in a way you didn't expect and illuminates something true within you. This summary is a starting point, a way to see if this path is one you want to explore. If anything we've talked about has resonated, I encourage you to pick up a copy. Reading it isn't just learning about grief. It's an experience that can genuinely change how you see love, loss, and the precious ordinary business of living. A link to the book is in the description below. Also, if you found this summary valuable, please click that like button and subscribe to the channel. It lets me know these journeys are meaningful to you and ensures you won't miss our next exploration into another life-changing book. Let's keep learning and growing together. Thank you for listening.